So there's a very long history of anti-Asian racism and sentiment in the United States. And to really understand its origins, we have to look back to the early 1800s to something that is called the coolie labor trade. Next slide. So the coolie labor trade was developed as a response to the abolition of slavery by the British Empire, which left a need for the British Empire to replace the labor of emancipated Africans. So the empire turned to laborers from South China and South Asia to work on their colonial plantations. And these laborers became known as coolies. They were part of a very degraded labor caste in the sense that they were forced to work in really impoverished conditions. And as a result, they developed an international reputation for being known as dirty and diseased. And this meant that by the time Chinese immigrants came to the United States in the mid 1800s as part of the San Francisco gold rush, they brought with them a lot of anti-coolie beliefs that had developed at this point. And this led to a lot of tensions between the white miners and the Chinese miners, and also anti-Asian violence and racism. Next slide. So this violence and racism can be understood as an ideology called yellow peril. And yellow peril is this idea that people of Asian descent are pollutants and threats to Western society, that they constitute a monolithic race that is made up of perpetual foreigners to the United States that can never possibly assimilate to US culture and society. This ideology has permeated so many different facets of US culture and society, including international relations and domestic affairs and popular culture. The ideology has justified many acts of US imperialism and warfare in Asia, for example, in Korea and Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it also has led to anti-immigrant legislation over the years, most notably with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the first landmark piece of legislation that barred immigration solely on the basis of nationality. And this anti-immigrant legislation was later expanded to include Asians of all ethnicities in 1924 and wasn't fully repealed until 1965. So the yellow peril ideology has also justified the violation of civil liberties of Asian Americans throughout history, such as the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II without due process, and the racial profiling and targeting of American Muslims of Asian and Arab descent in the post 9/11 war on terror. Next slide. So a lot of folks will say, okay, we have this thing today called the model minority myth, so that must mean that yellow peril ideology no longer exists. But actually, this is not true, because we can really understand the model minority myth as an extension or counterpart to the yellow peril ideology. And this is because both of these ideas are rooted in the idea that Asians are threatening to Western or US culture because they are exceptional in some way, whether that is, as the yellow peril says, they are exceptional for being dangerous and threatening and unassimilable, or as the model minority myth says, they are exceptional for being too excellent and therefore potentially threatening to US hegemony in global markets. So it's important to also understand that the model minority myth was coined in 1966 by a white male sociologist named William Peterson. And he coined this term in an article called Success Story, Japanese American Style, which was published in the New York Times. And in this article, he really praised Japanese Americans for overcoming discrimination. And in this way, weaponized the concept of model minority to shame Black and brown folks who were advocating for civil rights at the time, and also to erase and deny the history of systemic abuses against Asian Americans, including Japanese Americans. So the model minority myth often today is pointed to as a way of saying, oh, well, Asian Americans now have achieved a status that we can understand as white adjacency. But actually, it's especially in moments like our contemporary one, where we see an upsurge in anti-Asian racism and violence during this COVID pandemic, that we see how the status of white adjacency is conditional and very easily stripped away. Next slide. So the model minority myth says that Asian Americans are really passive and docile and hardworking and never protest the status quo or resist. But actually, this is very much not true. There is a long history of Asian American activism in the United States, just like there is a long history of anti-Asian racism in the United States. And I have on the slide here a few images to give a sense of this history of Asian American activism, images of activists protesting the war in Vietnam in the 1960s, or joining forces as part of the Third World Liberation Front to advocate for the creation of the first ethnic studies departments in the country. So I'm ending with these images just so that we can think as we move into our conversation about anti-Asian racism today, about how any form of activism or resistance against these forces is part of a long legacy that we should be proud of. Next slide. So I have just a few further resources if you'd like to learn more or get involved. And I believe we're going to be posting some of these links in the chat, so you can check them out there. Thank you so much. And we'll go back to you, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Roberta. As you can see, the sentiment that we're going to be talking about today is not a new concept for this country. It is not something that just started in the past year, and we would like to have a further conversation about this. I would like to introduce you to our guest panelists today, and I'd like to invite them to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. So our first panelist today is Dion Lim. She is a reporter with ABC7 in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has previously worked in Massachusetts, Kansas City, and Tampa Bay prior to coming to San Francisco. She is also the author of Make Your Moment, the Savvy Woman's Communication Playbook for Getting the Success You Want. Our second panelist is Mayor Lily May, who was sworn in December 2016 as the first woman and minority mayor in Fremont's 63-year history. She was first elected to the City Council in 2014. She represents Fremont's interests on critical infrastructure issues, including transportation and housing, contributes to the success of Fremont's public schools with a prior term on the Board of Trustees for the Fremont Unified School District in 2008 to 2014, and embraces diverse recreational and cultural programs. Today's event is a moderated conversation with Dion and Mayor May. They will briefly introduce themselves in their own words and talk about why they are here today. We will then have questions for Dion and Mayor May to answer, integrating many of the questions that have been submitted in advance, and we thank you for your thoughtful questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button on the webinar to submit your question during the open Q&A session. We cannot promise that we'll get to all of your questions, and we may group some together that have very similar themes. We will start with Dion Lim today.
Cindy, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And before we get started, I just want to say, Roberta, I'm so glad that you talked about the history, because people come up to me every single day and say, oh, you've been recently covering the xenophobia and hate toward Asian Americans. And my answer is always, no, this is not a new phenomenon, anything but. So before we get started, I just want to say, Lily, it's nice to see your face because you're so busy. I'm so busy. And finally, this is the only time we get to talk is during a Stanford panel. Great. So as you just heard, my name is Dion Lim. I'm a news anchor and reporter at ABC7 KGO TV here in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And it's been quite a trying year, to say the least. Maybe that's a little bit of an understatement. I want to get to two very simple slides that I wanted to show everyone, because I think this shows the magnitude of what I personally have been experiencing the past year, and also what you've probably noticed in the news as well. If we can get to the first slide, what you'll see here is that during the beginning of the pandemic, when it first broke out, I noticed right away an influx of coronavirus-related hate. Roberta touched upon this with the slide showing our former president, Donald Trump, coining the term and using it very frequently, China virus, and also terms like Kung flu, which only irritated and exacerbated the problem. So the coronavirus-related hate was very different from what we are experiencing in the first part of 2021. You can see from these images. Yes, there was a woman who was dragged through the Stockton Tunnel in San Francisco for her purse, which, by the way, only had about $100 inside. But below are instances that are not necessarily of violent nature. And that was what struck me as I look back on 2020. On the left, you'll see a woman who was putting very hateful letters saying that her Asian American neighbors needed to leave the country immediately. She was giving them an ultimatum that if they didn't leave, she would then take action and go to the feds. Very jarring, because some of these letters were posted on places like the playground or on people's lampposts. Next, there's a woman who is at a post office. She was caught on camera screaming at Asian Americans to stop being who they are and to leave the premise immediately. You people. The next one is a woman who was on a hike who caught this woman, who happened to be the CEO of a very large company, yelling that they needed to go back to where they belonged. And finally, the case that really kind of touched things off for me, that started this waterfall effect of covering these types of stories, was the man who all he was doing was collecting empty cans in San Francisco's Bayview district. And he wanted to provide some extra funding for his family. And ultimately, he was humiliated, made to cry. And this video was circulated around the globe. Now, I covered this for the greater part of 2020. If you take a look at the next slide that I have, and this is my last slide, I wanted to kind of keep it as simple as possible. This is just a very small sample of what we're experiencing now. And what is so shocking is that these are not just letters that are posted on a lamppost or on a playground. These are tangible acts of violence. And there's something that's very different in that these instances involve people that look like me. They look like you. They look like my mother, my father, my grandparents, my relatives and friends. And that's what's made it so challenging, at least for me, from an emotional fortitude standpoint. On the left is that story of Cindy. I'll say it for you because I had to practice this name about 100 times. Visha Ratanapakdi, the 84-year-old man from Thailand, who was seen, I broke this video of a man who was 19 years old, pushing him to the ground. He later died from a brain hemorrhage, among other internal injuries. The instance that you see in the center of your screen, this is the first of 3 incidents that really was a touchstone in Oakland's Chinatown, where senior citizens were being attacked brutally on camera. And the third was an Asian American homeowner who was held up at gunpoint and told to get down as they used semi-automatic weapons to go into their home. So getting back to the presentation and the full screen of me and Lily May, I wanted to have this conversation about what we are personally experiencing. Lily will talk about, from your point of view, some solutions and also what you have personally gone through, because this has not been easy. I mean, I touched upon mental fortitude, and after a while, you really experience that secondary trauma. And for me, growing up in very rural parts of the country, very non-diverse places like Michigan, Ohio, and Connecticut, I thought coming to the Bay Area, it was going to be, blue skies and songbirds. I would put my finger out on the window and a bluebird would land and everything would be glorious. But sadly, because I think we are so rich in our diversity, Fremont being one of those communities, we are seeing these instances of xenophobia, of hate, and you personally have also experienced it yourself. Can you elaborate a little bit about your personal journey and what you've seen in your area?
Sure. So thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. And Dion, I thank you for your support in making sure that this information is publicized. I'll share a little bit about my journey. So I was born in Chicago, grew up in Philadelphia. And again, I grew up in an area that was not predominantly Asian, because if you asked my classmates in school, if you knew the Chinese girl, they would say, oh, Lily. And it's very different in terms of diversity. But the reason why I think it's important that we have this conversation is that Fremont is fortunate enough to be a city which has a diverse population. It is a majority minority city, which is predominantly Asian, with Southeast Asian, Indian, and Chinese as being probably the largest ethnic populations. We also have the largest Afghan population outside of Afghanistan. But what we've seen in the last couple of years, and I would concur with you that these have certainly been challenging times, that it almost feels like baptism by a fire hose in terms of all the different events that have occurred, is that with this COVID awareness, people, I think, are being sheltered in place and being frustrated, whether it's with economic impacts or physical impacts of being sheltered in place. We're seeing an uprise, an uptick in terms of, in general, some of the anti-Asian sentiments that have been shared. I personally have experienced some of this as a child, and we talked about some of the history, and it's something that's not new. It's something that's been ongoing. And for me, growing up in Pennsylvania in the Vietnam War era, I've had everything maybe stuffed in lockers, had my tires slashed, my mailbox blown up, my windows shot out. So certainly a few experiences as a child. And at that point, you're sitting there wondering, why me? Because I don't understand what they're upset about as a child. And so that's why it's important in this situation, when I saw this occurring and the uptick in the community, that it's important that we, Dion, in the community, and are able to create a forum that creates this awareness to recognize that this is a problem that we need to address. And I'm very proud that in the past I was on the school board side and had served with Asian School Board Members Association, and currently I'm just immediate past president for APAMA, which is the Asian Pacific American Municipal Elected Officials, working with NLC and working with other federal advocacy groups and creating that awareness that we stand together, whether it's through COVID responsiveness or other methods, that we need to work together as a community. And more importantly, that we need to encourage people to not be fearful. And it's some of the things that we're going to discuss today is, what is a hate crime? And what are the ways that we can remedy or address it? And how can we work with our partner agencies, whether it's here in Fremont with Alameda County, with our media, and with our fellow ethnic organizations, to ensure that the voices are being heard and that people understand how important it is for us to tell the story, and that we prevent these from happening in the future, or that we at least create the tools and resources which are critical for us to be able to address them.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because this is a roadblock that I encounter in my own reporting, because here you have a group of people in our community who want their stories told so badly, right? But the first hurdle happens to be wanting to even share your story and that awareness component. I'm going to be very bold and say this just anecdotally, that I believe, based off of what people message me, and it is hundreds and hundreds of messages every single day, that about 90% of incidents that happen do not get reported to the authorities. And that is for a myriad of reasons. It's for out of fear of retaliation, culturally also. And you and I have talked about this, you know, as Asian Americans, sometimes we are taught by our elders to just keep your head down, your nose clean, do your job, and don't cause any trouble. I certainly was in that boat and felt that pressure not to stir the pot and cause any issues. So, you know, for whatever reason it is, we're not hearing from the people who are affected. And then on top of that, I work very closely with the Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, that online portal that collected almost 3,000 instances, stories of hate and xenophobia in a less than a year period in 2020. And they told me that 90% of what is reported does not rise to the level of a hate crime. And what I experienced, just so people can understand, is that a hate crime, from my experience of reporting, needs to be a definitive threat, a threat of violence, a threat of actionable something. That's how it can rise, because most of the time, if you write a slur like chink on a face mask and put it under someone's door, I mean, I hear it often from viewers that they're frustrated because there's no action on that. And I'll say, yeah, maybe I can do a story on that. But that's one, if the homeowner will talk to me. Two, I can actually get the video, and that's available to me as well, and I have permissions. But also three, people get frustrated because they say, how come that person can't be arrested? And I'm sorry, but maybe at the most that counts as vandalism, but in the grand scope of things, there are so many issues that law enforcement are dealing with that it does not rise to the level of a hate crime. So Lily, maybe you can share with everyone what you have also, what you'd like people to know about reporting, and then also more on that hate crime component, because it's a lot harder than many realize.
It is a lot harder, and I definitely share the frustrations of many in the community. Hate crime requires the proving the suspect's motivation for committing the crime was based against a bias of the group of people or specific characteristics. So they have to have both crime and motivation based on bias. And understandably, community members get very frustrated when it comes to hate speech that's directed to them. The First Amendment protects the rights of people from being prosecuted for offensive words, beliefs, or expressions. So although protected, the First Amendment, hate speech is not protected if it's linked to a crime or violence. They're directed towards an individual. We have been working with our local Alameda County DA, and I appreciate that Nancy O'Malley and her team have created a hate hotline. We did a public service announcement about a year ago when we started seeing this uptick in rise in crimes against Asian Americans. And talking to them, they're committed to following up on every call. If they know who the culprit is, they will try to work to educate them. It's also engaging efforts to outreach, as you mentioned, Stop AAPI Hate, and also other groups in terms of providing forums to have these talks about safety tips and to organize and create awareness. In fact, many older Asian Americans, and that's what worries me sometimes in these cases where they've been targeting elderly, are not as comfortable in making these reports. So they're also creating stronger support networks and relationships and language accessibility, which I think is very important, whether it's in the native language Chinese or having resources that are coming from Hong Kong or other areas of the world. The crime unit or the special unit, response unit actually is called is led by Annie Saidi Espinoza, and Rebecca Z, who's also well known in the Asian community, is a liaison who's connecting between the victims and their office. And there's a prosecution team being led by Chris Chin. But last year, they served over 1,400, almost 1,500 Asian American victims on these types of issues. And so that's kind of scary if you think about it, that's 90% are not being reported still. There's a long way to go. And yet sometimes it doesn't seem to rise to the occasion and visibility with the media and with just in general the stories. And we're seeking the awareness and support of our fellow elected officials of our cities, towns, and communities. And that's why our city joined many other cities across the United States in February in declaring a resolution and asking people to join us in reaffirming our commitment to the safety and well-being of our citizens from API heritage, but not just APIs. We also passed a resolution in the sense that we wanted to denounce xenophobia of any community, whether it's Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Muslim, Jewish, LGBTQ, or people with disabilities. We have to stand together and work on this type of solution and to create that recognition that no person should feel intimidated or unsafe to live in their communities.
I applaud all of these efforts so much because as much as it has to come from the top, from leadership positions, it also is on the ground too. And something I hear so often is that people want to help. Never before has there been so much attention on this subject matter, because I remember being in North Carolina, being in Florida, and being in an editorial meeting where I would get a response of, oh, racism still exists in America. Or I remember there was a nursery, I might have given this example to some people already, but there was a nursery that was selling Jap maples, and there was a giant billboard, and I brought it up, and nobody understood the history of why that was offensive. So what this brings me to is my next question about boots on the ground. Cindy, you mentioned 13-year-old Ashlyn So on the peninsula who started that rally. She's remarkable. I covered her when she was sewing masks at the beginning of the pandemic, trying to get those to healthcare workers and first responders when there was a shortage. I also recently covered the contractor who raised $6,000 seemingly overnight to buy 450 air horns to pass out to senior citizens. And that program, I just learned from the Oakland Chamber of Commerce, is actually working right now. I mean, it has been deployed multiple times and it has avoided some really sticky situations. So what I want to ask is that people obviously have been mobilizing. We're seeing patrols out, we're seeing shows of support online, whether it be on Facebook groups or even the recommendation of, hey, speak out, talk to Dion, or, post this in a chat group. But what would you say to the way in that it is presented? Some other tangible ways people can get involved. I mean, the criticism is sometimes, oh, we're going to go donate to a GoFundMe, but I don't see the results. I think it's going to take time. I think it's going to take very micro changes on a micro level first before we can really start seeing widespread change. What would your answer to that be?
Well, I have to say that Fremont was also recognized as one of the kindest cities and one of the best in California for kindness. And certainly in these times, it's not just about ethnic concerns, it's also about societal equity in terms of income and other areas. But what we've seen in this time period to help combat this negativity is that people have really risen to this occasion. And I'm so blessed and fortunate to see this. We've had people raising money for masks, we've given out hundreds of thousands of masks and food donations and restaurants. In particular, in the beginning, I know that there was some backlash to some of the Asian restaurants, and having a press conference to talk about what are some of the concerns and how it's important for us to support those businesses. And for them right now to then work and kindness also support our healthcare and frontline workers by providing donations. So creating more of that synergies that we're going to get through this when we're stronger together and working on these solutions is important. But these types of messaging and having this awareness, whether it's through videos that we can create and social media and having these stories told, this encourages others to join one another. And so that's what we're hoping to seek here is that creating that sense of community and that recognition. I myself would say that over the years, I've heard so many times that, oh, you should be complacent, you should be happy, you guys are all doing well. And that's not always the truth. I think that whole model minority creates that stigma for it's uncomfortable for us to ask for help or to create that awareness that there is different needs. And so I'm just so excited to be able to encourage others to get involved and get engaged. And when we work with different agencies, whether it's with the DA or with other ethnic and community organizations, we're going to be able to come up with more awareness and solutions. This is one of the first times in quite a few years that I've seen so many people mobilized. And I'm so sad to see that it took to the point where it had violence. I don't think it should take to that point. It should be an ongoing discussion and dialogue that we have on the school levels, on the county levels, on the city levels, that all people should be able to live safely in their communities and certainly not just target people based off of rhetoric that's misplaced or anger that's upset because of the cowardice of a keyboard or COVID coup because people are stuck in their feelings right now. We need to have this conversation today so that we can prevent and move forward in the future.
Yeah, I think it's best said because we were in Black History Month. A number of people said to me, you know what, it shouldn't be a month, it should be ongoing. And I feel that's the same way with addressing these issues and having these really challenging conversations, because sometimes it's not very comfortable to address some of these subjects. I mean, I won't go into it right now because it's a whole other conversation, but some of the tensions between different communities. But if you know the history, like what Roberta just touched upon very briefly, is that we actually have a lot of parallels in our struggles and parallels in our power issues and wanting to be seen and wanting to be heard. Do you think that you are supported? Because I know that working primarily in San Francisco and working primarily in Oakland, there is a lot of skepticism from the public about being heard from their elected leaders or working with law enforcement. But there are hurdles. I've kind of had to straddle that line. I hear both sides. And I know what some law enforcement is up against, the budgetary concerns. I mean, in Oakland, I know that they've had to cut back on patrols. Same with San Francisco and not having, they rededicated funds for liaisons who speak native languages. They have dedicated neighborhood groups that go out and try to forge a bond with members of the community. Do you see that happening in Fremont? And, what do you also wish that you would like to work on a little bit more going forward this year?
Sure. I know that this is a tough conversation. And we in Fremont, when we were facing some of these conversations last year, we had Engage Fremont and we did particularly extra efforts in terms of community outreach. But again, much like you talk about history months and other things, it's not about one day or one moment. It's about the ongoing support and partnership that we have. One of the things that I miss greatly in this time period is we used to have coffee with the cops or, community. We had boba with the cops, coffee with the cops, cannoli with the cops. These kind of some theme there with sweetness and happiness. But having those abilities to go out to the community, and even our national night outs every year in August, I mean, where we got up to the point of almost 1,500 parties in one night, and to get out and talk to each other. I think what people would find is when they're talking to one another, while there are many struggles, there's much more in commonalities in all the different issues. And whether it's talking about healthcare and access or stability, there's a lot of different areas in terms of synergy between all of us as communities that we can work on. And that's what we hope to be able to create together, is to have these outreach. We are very blessed also. We have an interfaith worship day. We have also interfaith Thanksgiving, and having those outreaches to learn how much you can appreciate about your neighbor and the values that you share in common allow us then to be able to have this difficult conversation when these times come. I'll give a perfect example of how you can flex in these times. National League of Cities, which I am part of that organization, has federal advocacy groups, and oftentimes they have the retreats individually as organizations. Last year, because we couldn't meet individually in our own retreats, we decided to hold a joint advocacy meeting. And one of my favorite memories from last year, before we went into this COVID shutdown, is we were all together after the meeting, and karaoke was happening. And we were singing together, and we were singing "We Are Family." And if you look up at the stage, you're like, wow, that's a very unique family. But it's the fact that we recognize that we have much more in betterment and interest if we work together. And so I was worried, I'll be honest, when we had the PAMO meeting, whether or not people would show up, because right then was when we were talking about the Wuhan virus and people were very hesitant. But I really appreciated my fellow leaders from across different ethnic and different federal advocacy groups stepping forward and saying, we stand with you. We recognize this is a problem. We're not going to back away from it. We join you in trying to address this. And so that's what we're looking for.
You know, Cindy, if it's okay, I think I want to get to some of the Q&A because we are getting a lot more than I even expected, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to address them. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paula. She's the one that's running our Q&A today, and she'll be reading the questions that have been submitted so far.
Great.
After Ahmaud Arbery was killed by a private citizen, there was a massive and sustained outcry quarterbacked by NAACP, Color of Change, Black Lives Matter. And then by contrast, our response feels more piecemeal, sporadic, and driven by individuals, more focused on education and data collections. What flagship or heavy clout organizations are galvanizing and organizing API's ongoing political and media response nationwide?
That's a good question. At least for me, I can only speak to the ones that I am personally involved with or have spoken with. One of them is the Asian American Journalists Association, because one of their jobs is to better represent not only the stories that are coming in, but to also address those challenging issues of, you know, are these issues racially motivated? And then also to work with the National Association of Black American Journalists. So on that front, that's what I would, say that I'm most involved with on a nationwide scale.
Thank you. Well, here in Fremont, we had these conversations and we invited people to come together. And that's one of the things that I think is important, is to bring the community together in these challenging times to address this. And it's also really important that we are allowing people the opportunity to express and educate. And that's one of the things, it's not about just that one moment or that demonstration, because we had 11 here in Fremont, and I personally joined 7 of them. But it's the fact that we have these educational opportunities, that we provide programs like for the city to provide the outreach and history through our library programs, to provide opportunities in terms of internships, to work with different groups. And I was just part of Tesla. They had an engineering, introduce a girl to engineering day, and that we make sure that we bring people of diverse backgrounds and to provide those opportunities. That's why when we consider some of our workforce development and programs like Makerspace, we didn't do it at one specific school site or anything, is we did it at the library because that's something that everyone has access to. And so creating those opportunities and that ability to have equity and access is important for us as a city.
And Mei Ling, I forgot to mention, I've actually been very fortunate that ABC and Disney has been exceptionally supportive. And of course, we are a global company. So we were at the forefront of holding town hall meetings. And we were the first to hold a town hall in early 2020 when it was recognized that this was becoming really kind of a marathon, not so much a sprint. And then also on Thursday, I'll be taking part in a Disney-wide ABC Live hour-long discussion with my colleagues across the country to kind of exemplify that this is not just a Bay Area issue, it's happening all over.
Other organizations I think that are very active in this are PAPA and other Asian Law Alliance and other groups that are talking about this, because I think that it raises up awareness of how we can work with other ethnic and faith-based groups, and whether it's for people with disabilities or other challenges that are facing us. We want people to understand that they can work with us and that we can understand and create more education. I think it begins, having been a school board member, with the youngest of age, because I don't think children are brought with this knowledge of hating any one group or others. It's the way that we teach them. And that's why it's important that we create the outreach early and continually work with this on our discussions.
And you just started to answer the next question here from Maria. How can we promote allyship with other BIPOC communities and movements so that we can start to elevate some of the issues that we're facing within our own community?
Well, I know for me, when I was on the school board for California, we used to have a council of presidents. And the reason why I thought it was important is that many times on leadership teams, you'll see an Asian at large, a Black at large, or one person at large. But rather than having it individually represented, we started working on a council of presidents that allowed the different ethnic educational communities and their board and leadership to come together and talk about these challenging discussions about accessibility of programs, about outreach. And that way it allowed us to have better visibility with the whole board of directors when we work together. And so that's one of the things that we hope for here in Fremont. And then with our youth, we have our youth commissioners and human relations. And we are hoping that when they are talking to one another, it really allows that outreach. The other program, I think, when we talk about the concerns for elders, we also have a peer group here for peer counseling. And we're so blessed as a city every year to get about 25 to 30 applicants from all different ethnic backgrounds and language skills. And when they're able to go out and talk to their own fellow seniors and others, to be able to create those resources and just to create someone to listen and understand, that helps us with be able to move this forward.
And I would just piggyback off that by saying it's interesting to see how people are sharing their story, because automatically people think, oh, it's only got to be through a television news story that's 1 or 2 minutes long and I have to bare my entire soul. But I think that can show solidarity as something as small as making a comment on a group page that you want to support. If you say, yeah, let me share a little bit about why I find this valuable, that sometimes is enough to trigger someone else to share more of their story or to throw more resources behind an effort, because it really does take a lot of encouragement on that side. And I would also go so far as to say, on the flip side, to also be careful of what you are seeing on social media and the organizations that you do comment on or want to weigh in with a few words, because I've encountered many times different groups that appear to be into allyship, but on the surface, with a little research, I realized, oh, they're actually quite hateful in some of their speech or some of their background. I'll give you a really quick example. I met a group in Chinatown in Oakland that said, oh, put us on the news, do an interview with us, we're here to help. But on closer inspection, thanks to another community member who pulled me aside, showed me a whole bunch of posts that they had made calling people in the African-American community the N-word. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what if I had elevated, their point of view? That would have been so detrimental in so many ways. So, just kind of remember to teeter, just be careful of where you are throwing your support behind.
Andy mentions a recent article in Oakland side about recent events in Oakland Chinatown, that they might not have been racially motivated and instead had more to do with class and people struggling with the pandemic. This article also quoted Chinatown organizations. Do you have any thoughts to add about this?
Yeah, so many. And I'm really glad, Andy, that you brought this up. Believe it or not, I have sources who tell me that that one man who was pushed to the ground, I forgot how old he was. Isn't that terrible that there have been so many instances that I don't even recall? I can't even keep them all straight. Um, was not Asian. There's a possibility that he might be Latino. And despite informing many people of this, different networks still refer to this person as Asian. So we just have to be very careful in our reporting. And then also going a step beyond that, and something that I'm very passionate about is being careful to note that not all crimes that Asians experience or attacks are racially motivated. And that's something that I've had to pull back on too, right? Because isn't it easy for us to just kind of go over the deep end and say, oh, automatically it's racism, it's hate. But I think if we do that too often and it is determined later that it's not, that it is a victim of circumstance, then that's not the best reflection on us. But on the other hand, as well, I've been told by law enforcement off the record that, a lot of times Asian Americans are targeted, one, because we are a little bit smaller in stature. I mean, that's just a physicality of Asian Americans, minus Jeremy Lin and Yao Ming and people who are very tall and get to be very large. But also, because senior citizens, right, congregate in Chinatowns oftentimes and have that perception of carrying a lot of cash. Before the Lunar New Year, there is always a story about people being attacked because the perception is that they have got gold jewelry on. And here's the deal. A lot of them know not to do that now, but there is still that stereotype. So, it's again, making sure we draw the line, being very careful in our reporting. And also, as citizens, I would encourage everyone who's tuning in to be very careful about what you post, because that disinformation can be very harmful for us, not just as journalists, but as citizens of our community.
Also, what is your perspective on working in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and Black and Brown advocacy groups? There's a concern that when we're requesting more law enforcement against Black and Brown communities, we may be essentially putting a target on their backs or making them more susceptible to police brutality. How can we both protect our Asian elders and also hold people accountable for acts of violence without furthering racist acts on other communities?
I think that is one of the biggest challenges I know people feel very sensitive about, but what I believe in is that we need to work together to create that awareness, and without just saying that it's a blame of any group of people, because when you look at these situations, there's much more in common in terms of the challenges we're facing, in terms of wanting to be recognized and respected. And it's important for everybody in our community, whether it's with physical disability or a different social class. We've had these types of intense conversations as a city and throughout the nation right now about homelessness in other areas. And so it's how we work together on addressing the solutions. I'm very much a proponent in working with our other ethnic and faith-based groups to talk about these conversations. It's not easy to have. And I think it's also important that we are able to keep the information factual, because we do need our community to be aware of what concerns and things to look out for. And without it being saying that it's any one group of people, because there are good people and bad people in every ethnicity and every types of situation. But we absolutely have to have this conversation. And we need to make sure that we recognize and are cognizant of, when we work through these discussions, that we include others in this conversation, whether it's about policing or about just our community outreach and how we can protect and serve one another.
Yeah, it's super sensitive of a topic. And I know there are so many emotions, people are politically charged as well. And the reason why I've not addressed this head on quite yet is because I'm not ready yet, because I need the data. And I have a data journalist who's working with me right now, who's pulling statistics, right? Because I think it's fair for me to say that I have a large amount of people who say, oh, look at the perpetrators in these incidents. Don't you want to speak out on it? Yes, but I don't know enough about it yet, because I don't know, because it's not categorized. There are no studies, there are no reports out. We have to go dig, and that's going to take time. So I encourage everyone to exercise a little bit of patience as well, because look, I mean, you saw with the history of the slides Roberta showed, I mean, this is centuries in the making. It's going to take much, much longer to undo some of these feelings and some of these tensions.
But I do think that right now, one of the things that is occurring when we have this discussion about social justice and racism, that we don't have the Asian population or group left out of this conversation, as this is a long history and legacy. This is not something new that's just occurred today, and that we have to absolutely make sure that we are also part of this discussion. And it's easy sometimes when we're focused on different conversations that some of this gets left to the side. And that's why I'm really pleased to see that Dion and all of you are allowing us to facilitate this, to create the awareness that is essential for people to even have this conversation. Because it's easy for people to say, well, that's not really a crime, being chased by a car, being spit on, being chased, or other areas. So that we need to be able to allow people to say, this is not acceptable for us across all different groups, and that we want to make sure that we can work on this together.
Oh, and off of what you just said,
Yes.
please, everyone, remember that what you are feeling is valid, because there are going to be many detractors, people who say, yes, that is not a hate crime, so therefore it does not deserve the attention. I mean, before coming to KGO, I've had to fight for some of these stories to be told, and that applies to your everyday life as well. And I would encourage everyone to not second guess how you are feeling about a certain something. I've heard from numerous people who say, oh, well, law enforcement, they say that maybe I'm overreacting or it's not as big of a deal. You know what? It is a big deal. And if you have that confidence that what you're feeling is valid, I think that helps a lot. And that's part of the first steps, I think, to making some tangible change.
Well, to stem off of that, I think that's why it's so important. I'm surprised sometimes when I go out to these meetings and they're having women luncheons, how few Asian leadership is out there. I mean, I was surprised and privileged and honored to be the first Asian mayor for our city. But nationally, for large cities, I learned from APACS during one of the Women's History Month a couple of years ago that I'm the third directly elected large city Asian mayor in US history. So I'm like, okay, we really need to up that. And the ways that we can improve that is by supporting our next generation, by fostering these opportunities, whether it's internship or other programs. And then even if it's an Asian male or other groups, for them to join in supporting and fostering the opportunities rather than saying, I concur with Dion in the sense that sometimes people are like, oh, it's a little dismissive. You're there already. You're doing fine. Whether it's in elected or in school or in technology. I formerly was a worldwide sales controller in a high tech company. And while there are a lot of APIs working in the business, there are not as many in the leadership roles and the glass. There's a definite bamboo ceiling in those areas. And so having that ability to address that and the courage to talk about that is important.
And Lily, I actually want to skip ahead a little bit and make sure we get to this because it pertains to what you just mentioned. Helen Yu writes in to say, why isn't there mainstream media coverage about the rising hate crime? Seems only like Asian anchors reporting the crimes. What can citizens do for the media to take this seriously? You bring up a great point, Helen, because I'll admit, because you'll learn that I'm pretty much an open book and I have a lot of candor when I speak. I felt like I was the only one championing this issue. And for a while, I think that was true. And now we are getting more mainstream attention because now we are seeing actual dedication on airtime across the networks, not just mine, and on a national level to what's happening. But I think it's also important, Lily, despite having representation and how much that matters, it's even more powerful in a way to get people who are not Asian American to want to champion these stories. And I've always said to be a good newsroom steward, letting go of some of these stories and letting someone else take them on. Whether or not they'll have the perspective is one thing, but still to have someone be the face that is not Asian American also helps bridge that gap. In Oakland's Chinatown, one of the first stories that came out was a man named Jacob Azevedo, I believe his last name is, Latino guy. And I said, why do you want to help make a chaperone program for seniors when you are Latino? And he said, well, it's my job because I get affected by this too. And I thought that was so powerful. And he's become kind of like a beacon for the community in some ways. I haven't necessarily seen a lot of the work that he's done since, but just knowing that he's there inspired a lot of people. So that would be my answer to you is trying to get others on board who are not Asian to understand the importance.
Absolutely. That's why it's working with, as I mentioned, so we've had some conversation about schools and education with PTAs and other groups that start young, that we encourage, it's not just one group's issue, it's all of our issue. Because for us to have a better society and a better community, we need to really support one another. And that's why it's important for us, whether we're celebrating Black History Month or Women History Month, that we create this fabric that we allow people to interact and to be able to bond with one another and to be cognizant of the strength that we can bring. I always tell people that I love the idea of hope right now and try to share that. And that if we could just all help one person each, that it would create a better society. And so that's what it sounds like Jacob and so many others are taking up that challenge. And to say that it's not just my someone else's problem, it's my brother's problem, my sister's problem, and that we're better if we work together as a family.
Mayor May and Dion, thank you so much for the insights and all the information that you've shared today. As we start to wrap up this conversation, do you have any final thoughts for our audience today?
Well, I think that for the final thoughts for me is that I really appreciate this chance to have this very candid conversation, and that it's really important that we don't wait just for these situations to occur to have this dialogue. It should be something that's ongoing, and that we reach out to our communities and work with one another, whether it's educational institutions. I thank Stanford for this invitation for this forum, or through news media, where it becomes more common for us to have the courage to raise up these commonalities. In the end, whether it's through COVID times or just in general, we need to be able to share this history, to create this pathway to help foster and support one another. And I always tell people, as a mayor right now, we're dealing with a lot of challenges, and it's the physical health of COVID, it's the fiscal health of our budget, and it's the mental health. And so allowing us to work with one another creates more strength and synergy. And so I absolutely concur that it can't be just a conversation with the Asian members at the table. It's about including all other ethnic groups, and especially people of color, Black, Indigenous, and others to this table, that we have a forum and we create this more awareness. And so Stanford and also ABC News, I really appreciate this, and all of the people in the audience. I know many people are writing to us right now and sharing their thoughts. And I'm encouraged by this, because I feel that when they're willing to have this candid talk, it really allows us to be able to better move forward. And so I'm hoping that it's something that, rather than just complaining about these issues, sometimes we hear about that, especially as elected officials or as parents in other areas. It's about, I always tell my children and others, it's about what can you do to help? What can you do to bring a solution? And that's how we're going to really make the difference.
Yeah, I love absolutely everything you had to say. And I just want to recognize all the people who are here, and then also those who wrote in with some really thoughtful comments and questions. I just want you to know that I see them and I hear you. And to please connect with me on social media. That's probably the best way to reach with me. But I just want to say sometimes it feels overwhelming, right? And Lily, you hear some of the complaints, a lot of the complaints, as do I, and criticisms. And I would say this to anyone who is feeling overwhelmed or feeling like they don't know where to start. There are so many resources, as you know, some that we touched upon, and many more if you just look a little bit deeper. But know that just the smallest of actions, even if it is just saying in passing, and I had to do this not too long ago, when someone was spreading some false information about Asian Americans. You know, I said something in front of a large group of people to dispel that myth. And I think even though it didn't have a tangible reaction or response right away, I know I was heard. So if you all could just remember that, you know, I think it's going to take some small steps to make a large impact, but we're going, and that should be encouraging enough. I say it sometimes feels like 2 steps forward, 10 steps back, but we really are making advances. And I just want to say you are all, by being here, a part of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dion and Mayor May, for your time today and sharing your thoughts on this topic. We hope that the attendees, that you found some value in our conversation today and provided you some things to think about and consider. Before we end today, if you aren't already a member, please consider joining our mailing list. You can sign up at asf.stanford.edu or for FACS at philamstaff.stanford.edu to learn more about our upcoming events. If you have any additional follow-up comments, please feel free to reach out to any members of our board, to our boards. We are putting a post-survey link into the chat. Your feedback will be greatly appreciated about this event. We're also sharing resources to community organizations and other groups that are tackling the issues that were brought up today. I would like to thank the team behind the scenes that helped to put this event together. First, Jenny Visitation, who connected ASF and FACS to Dion and Mayor May, to Roberta Wilson for her presentation today, to Laura Ma and to Steve Choi, who were our technical producers, and to Maylin Gonzalez and Cindy Ng for managing our Q&A today, and the leadership teams of our two groups for putting this event together. We learned a lot in a short period today about putting together a webinar. Thank you so much for coming today and for your continued support of the Stanford staff groups, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.